Hey class, this is Mr. Clark. These are the video lecture notes for History 17B, Chapter 30, Political Storms at Home and Abroad, 1968 to 1980. Next slide. There's a visual overview of the chapter. Next slide. The first heading is entitled Identity Politics in a Fractured Society. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Native Americans, gays and lesbians, and women organized to change discriminatory laws and pursue government support for their interests, a strategy known as identity politics. Next slide. Others, disenchanted with the status quo, distanced themselves from white middle-class America by forming their own counterculture. Next slide. These movements centered on a desire for peace, the rejection of material goods and traditional morality, concern for the environment, and drug use in pursuit of spiritual revelations. Next slide. These tactics, whose aim and tactics posed a challenge to the existing state of affairs, often met with hostility from individuals, local officials, and the U.S. government alike. Next slide. Still, they persisted, determined to further their goals and secure for themselves the rights and privileges to which they were entitled as American citizens. Next slide. The next heading is entitled Coming Apart, Coming Together. In the wake of anti-war and civil rights protests and the chaos of the 1968 Democratic National Convention, many Americans welcomed Nixon's promise to uphold law and order. Next slide. During his first term, Nixon strode a moderate middle path in domestic affairs, attempting with little success to solve the problems of inflation and unemployment. Next slide. He made substantial progress in foreign policy, however, establishing diplomatic relations with China for the first time since the Communist Revolution there. Here's a photograph of Nixon in China. Next slide. Nixon also entered into a policy of détente with the Soviet Union. Here he's shown shaking hands with the Soviet leader Brezhnev after signing the SALT agreement. Next slide. As the war in Vietnam raged on, Americans were horrified to hear of atrocities committed by U.S. soldiers. By the way, this is, we're on a new heading, Vietnam, the Downward Spiral. Next slide. To try to end the conflict, Nixon escalated it by bombing Hanoi and invading Cambodia. Next slide. His actions provoked massive anti-war demonstrations in the United States that often ended in violence, such as the tragic shooting of unarmed student protesters at Kent State University in 1970. Next slide. The 1971 release of the Pentagon Papers revealed the true nature of the war to an increasingly disapproving and disenchanted public. The Pentagon Papers showed, for example, how the government exaggerated statistics to make it seem as if the United States was winning the war when in fact we weren't. Next slide. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger eventually drafted a peace treaty with North Vietnam and, after handing over responsibility of the war to South Vietnam, the United States withdrew its troops in 1973. Next slide. South Vietnam surrendered to the North 2 years later. Next slide. The next heading is entitled Watergate. In 1972, President Nixon faced an easy re-election against a Democratic Party in disarray. Next slide. But even before his landslide victory, evidence had surfaced that the White House was involved in the break in at the Democratic National Committee's headquarters at the Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C. This is the Watergate complex. Next slide. As the investigation unfolded, the depths to which Nixon and his advisors had sunk became clear. Next slide. Eventually, Nixon resigned, and his successor, Gerald Ford, was unable to solve the pressing problems the United States faced or ease the stain of Watergate. Next slide. The next section is entitled Carter. Jimmy Carter's administration began with great promise, but his efforts to improve the economy through deregulation largely failed. Next slide. Carter's attempt at a foreign policy built on the principle of human rights also prompted much criticism, as did his decision to boycott the Summer Olympics in Moscow after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. Next slide. On the other hand, he successfully brokered the beginnings of a historic peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. And these were known as the Camp David Accords. Here's Anwar Sadat, Carter, and Menachem Begin, the leader of Israel. Next slide. Remaining public faith in Carter was dealt a serious blow, however, when he proved unable to free the American hostages held in Iran. Next slide. And that's it for Chapter 30.